So this is a presentation that is actually more about taking stock of what we know about taxing capital, income, and wealth. Actually, what the little knowledge we have about how this is done in low and middle income countries, but also taking a step back, thinking about principles and gaps and what's next. So as we have been discussing throughout, there is growing demands to tax capital, income, and wealth more in general, like across the world, and this is motivated by many different facts. High income and wealth inequality that has been documented is considered too high, and it's important to understand also that the estimates that we have is tricky to measure comprehensive income and comprehensive wealth in any country, and even more so in low and middle income countries because there is not enough data. And the estimates, there is increasing evidence that estimates may vary in terms of inequality within country depending on the data use and the method. The other important fact is that is relatively newer, is that high income and high net worth individuals pay proportionally less income tax as a share of their income, but most of this evidence as well is from high income countries. And this is related to 4 points mainly. One is that capital income is relatively more important at the top, is often taxed more likely than employment income, that avoidance, such as income shifting or migration, is more accessible and practiced at the top of the distribution, and as well as evasion. And in addition, there has been some shift in conventional principles in terms of how we think what's the optimal way to tax capital, for example. That conventionally for a long time, it has been thought that the optimal was to tax capital zero because otherwise you introduce lower incentives to invest and undermines growth, etc. But the literature, normatively and the economic empirical literature, has been challenging these assumptions. And also, there has been a lot of developments in enforcement mechanisms, such as the automatic exchange of information and technology that makes evasion and avoidance more like a function of administration decisions as well. So I don't think I have a lot of time, so as we know, this call for increasing domestic revenue mobilization is also becoming more salient in low and middle income countries, even though they collect very little from personal income taxes and from wealth taxes. So in practice, what happened? Do we have to tax capital income and or wealth more? How do we do it? It's an unsettled question. I'm going to describe very briefly, or maybe just tell you, that tax systems actually vary in design, scope, and administration across countries, and usually they tend to try to balance equity, efficiency, revenue objectives using imperfect and complementary instruments, and recent normative work, as I said, is ambiguous, but we know very, very little about taxpayers, their assets, their wealth, their sources of incomes, and how they respond to taxes in low and middle income countries. And as part of some work I'm doing with my colleagues at TaxDev, what we want to do is to characterize the tax treatment of capital and labor income beginning with sub-Saharan countries and compute stylized effective tax rates for hypothetical individuals and eventually look at combining this with microdata. So just recapping as well, there are different ways to tax capital, income, and wealth. So we have taxes on capital, income in the form of interest, dividend, royalties, etc., taxes on the transfers of wealth, and taxes on the stock of wealth. And recent evidence from OECD countries, for example, these are effective tax rates for a hypothetical taxpayer, shows that it's of dividends, for example, if we look at dividends and employment, but consider both what is remitted by the firms and the individual, so corporate income tax for dividends, for example, and social security contributions for employment income. We see that dividends tend to be taxed less than labor in most OECD countries. We just collected some data looking at statutory rates on capital income in Africa across a range of countries. And we also see that, so the blue line is the statutory rate for personal income tax. And then you have the top rate for different sources of income from available public sources. And you tend to see some countries on paper, right? These are tax rates. It doesn't consider the tax base exemption to the tax base that can erode actually tax liabilities in practice. But we do see that in general, capital income is taxed at a lower rate. Sometimes some sources are not taxed at all, etc. In terms of wealth taxes, so these are for like 160 countries, again, from work in progress, but we know that apart from property taxes that are quite prevalent across all type of, across income levels, the stock of wealth is not, taxing the stock of wealth is not very prevalent, and transfers of wealth are not, taxes on inheritance or gifts are not prevalent either, as much as other taxes. So when we think about, so we know they don't collect a lot of tax, so I have 5 minutes, I want to do something quickly, but we know inheritance taxes like don't collect a lot as a share of revenue, not even in OECD countries that have better systems, supposedly, better administration capacities. And so that doesn't mean that they cannot be improved, but at the moment, they are not that effective. And it's related to, again, exemptions to the tax base and enforcement evasion, etc. So I want to briefly share with you some thoughts in terms of what do we know from the normative and empirical evidence in terms of thinking of the equity efficiency trade-off of taxing the capital income, the stock of wealth, or both. And so what we results from the normative theory vary a lot, and they vary particularly along key assumptions that are related to, that can be classified in 4 broad topics, but I'm sure there are other important points. So one is that thinking about the drivers of heterogeneous levels of in wealth and capital income matters when thinking how we tax these. And so if you inherit, if you have inheritance versus you have wealth because you work and you save to finance consumption in the future, is different than just inheriting wealth from I don't know, a relative, your dad or your mom or whatever. The other important point is how do we think about externalities of wealth or income concentration? So previous models, for example, they just assume, or many models have assumed that people just work, save, consume in the future, and concentrate, like taxing capital income could be detrimental for investment and growth, but actually there are new models and new thinking in terms of the negative externalities of wealth and income concentration that I don't have time to discuss in detail, but I think it's important because then it changes the result normatively and the evidence is out there still. Evasion level and the elasticities of reported wealth and income. So, for example, just thinking about broad wealth taxes, taxpayers with equal wealth pay equal tax. But these taxes the normal returns to capital. I have 2 minutes left. And favors excess returns, so rents, economics rents. So if excess returns are driven by productive activities, for example, you want to subsidize them. And because you want to a better allocation of capital, increase productivity, increase growth. And so there are new papers saying actually don't tax capital income, tax wealth, because you are promoting better entrepreneurship, because wealth is the result of high ability entrepreneurs. If excess returns are driven by lack or rent seeking mainly, and in practice nothing is one or the other, it's a combination, then tax capital income. So there are important design and implementation of issues that one needs to think for both type of taxes and across capital income taxes as well, because there are different types. And I don't have much time, but these things matter, and we can discuss more after the presentation. What we do, one important piece of information from empirical evidence is understanding how these individuals respond in practice, right? And for that, we need a lot of data and estimations of how they respond to tax rates, to changes in the tax base, across tax bases. And we have the WIDER team here that have worked on different projects, looking at this in low American countries, but also UCA has worked on, for example, income shifting in Finland some years ago. And what we know is it varies by tax, rates, base, nature of reform, context, methodology. It's not, the elasticities are not fixed. If evasion is enforcement or the legal structure changes, it can affect how much people can respond to these taxes. And I have 0. So we have, I cite some of the work that has been done by our colleagues here. And elsewhere, I think what just says, there are a lot of gaps, we need to do more work, and we are planning to do a bit of that, but I think it's a collective community goal. Thank you.